There's a certain kind of silence that falls over a room right before someone's whole world flips upside down. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's just still. Like the air itself knows what's coming, even if the people standing in it don't. That's the silence I remember most from that night. Not the applause, not the music, not even the champagne glasses clinking together under the chandeliers of the Grand Hallwell ballroom. Just that one still second, right before my father looked up at the wall behind the stage and saw my name carved into gold lettering 3 feet tall. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 34 years, my father told anyone who would listen that he didn't raise a single child worth bragging about. He said it at Thanksgiving dinners. He said it at his poker nights with his old army buddies. He said it once, right to my face, at my own college graduation, when he leaned over during the ceremony and whispered, "Don't get used to people clapping for you. This isn't going to happen again." I was 22 years old, in a cap and gown, holding a diploma I'd worked 4 years to earn, and my father's first words to me were a warning not to feel proud of myself. I want to tell you how a man like that, a man who spent 3 decades making sure I understood exactly how little he expected from me, ended up standing in a hospital gala in front of 300 of the city's wealthiest donors, staring up at a plaque with my name on it, realizing that the daughter he called the disappointment had just funded the entire pediatric wing he was about to give a speech praising. But to understand how we got to that moment, you have to go back. Back to a house on Maple Ridge Lane, where I learned very early that love in my family was something you earned, and I never seemed to earn enough of it. Stay with me, because what happened in that ballroom didn't happen by accident. It took 15 years, a broken engagement, 2 failed businesses, 1 anonymous donation, and a decision I made in a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning that I would never again build my life around waiting for my father's approval. This is the story of how silence became my weapon, how patience became my plan, and how one plaque on one wall said more than 34 years of words ever could. Let's start at the beginning. I was the middle child of 3. My older brother Daniel was the golden son, the one who played varsity football, the one whose trophies lined the fireplace mantel like a shrine. My younger sister Amanda was the baby, the one my father called his little princess, the one who never had to ask twice for anything. And then there was me. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because it's the truth, and the truth matters here. From the time I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, I understood that in my house, attention was a limited resource, and it had already been divided up before I was born. My father, Robert Whitfield, was a hard man, not cruel in the way you see in movies. No yelling, no violence, nothing you could point to and call abuse. His cruelty was quieter than that. It lived in comparisons, in size, in the way he'd look at my report card full of A's and simply say, "Danny got A's too, and he did it while starting varsity." It lived in the way he'd forget to ask how my day was, but somehow always remembered every detail of Amanda's ballet recitals. My mother Linda tried. I'll give her that. She was the one who came to my school plays when my father said he was too tired. She was the one who told me quietly, tucking me into bed, "Your father loves you, Claire. He just doesn't know how to show it." But even as a child, I remember thinking, if love needs someone else to translate it for you, is it really love at all? I remember one specific afternoon when I was 10 years old, bringing home a spelling bee trophy from school, the only trophy I'd ever won, a small, cheap plastic thing that probably cost $3, but to me, at 10, it was everything. I ran into the house holding it above my head, breathless with excitement, and found my father in the living room watching Daniel's football game highlights on tape, something he did most evenings. "Dad, look, I won the spelling bee," I said, holding the trophy out toward him. He glanced over, gave a small nod, and said, "That's good, sweetheart," before turning his attention back to the television, where Daniel was celebrating a touchdown in grainy VHS footage. He didn't ask what word I'd won on. He didn't ask how many kids I'd competed against. He didn't ask anything at all. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, trophy still raised slightly, waiting for a follow-up question that never came, before quietly walking to my room and setting it on my dresser, where it stayed for years, collecting dust, a small monument to a moment nobody else in my house had thought worth revisiting. Contrast that with the celebration 2 weeks later, when Daniel made the honor roll for the first time in his life, a genuine accomplishment for him, since academics had never come easily. My father took him out for ice cream, called his own brothers to tell them the news, and mentioned it at the next 4 family gatherings I can remember. I don't say this to diminish Daniel's achievement. It was real, and he deserved recognition for it. But the disparity in how our accomplishments were treated taught me something at a very young age. My achievements were expected, and therefore invisible, while Daniel's were exceptions, and therefore celebrated. By the time I was in high school, I had learned to stop expecting anything from him. Not out of bitterness, at least not yet, but out of self-preservation. If you stop expecting rain, you stop being disappointed every time the sky stays dry. I threw myself into school instead. Books didn't compare me to my siblings. Books didn't sigh when I walked into the room. I graduated 3rd in my class, got into a solid state university on a partial scholarship, and for one brief moment, sitting in the audience at my high school graduation, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the achievement big enough to finally make my father look at me the way he looked at Daniel when he scored a touchdown. He didn't come. He said work couldn't spare him. My mother came alone, cried through the entire ceremony, and told me afterward, "He's proud of you, sweetheart. He just doesn't say it." I was 17 years old, and I already knew that sentence by heart. He's proud of you, he just doesn't say it. I'd heard some version of it my entire childhood, and somewhere around that graduation stage, holding my diploma with my mother's arms around me, and an empty seat where my father should have been, I stopped believing it. That was the moment I made a promise to myself, quietly, the kind of promise you don't tell anyone about, because saying it out loud makes it feel too fragile. I promised myself that one day I would build a life so undeniably successful that no comparison, no excuse, no sigh could ever diminish it again. I just didn't know yet how long that road would be, or how much it would cost me to walk it. There's one memory that I've carried with me longer than almost any other. It happened at my cousin's wedding when I was 20 years old, home from college for the summer. The reception was loud, full of relatives I only saw once or twice a year. The kind of family gathering where everyone asks the same 3 questions. How's school? Do you have a boyfriend? What are you going to do with your life? My father was 3 drinks in, standing with his brothers near the bar, and I overheard him, not meant for my ears, but I heard it anyway, laughing as he said, "Danny's going to run his own construction company someday, mark my words. Amanda, she's got that spark. She'll marry well or start her own thing. Claire." He paused. He actually paused, like he was searching for something, anything, to say about me. "Claire's smart. She'll probably end up teaching somewhere. Nothing wrong with that." Nothing wrong with that. He said it like it was a consolation prize, like being smart, being driven, being the one who never got in trouble, never asked for money, never caused him a single sleepless night. Like all of that added up to nothing more than nothing wrong with that. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because for years I thought there was something wrong with me for not crying in moments like that. I just felt something harden inside me, like a door quietly closing and locking itself from the inside. Later that night, driving back to my dorm 3 hours away, I replayed his words over and over. Danny's going to run his own company. Amanda will marry well or start her own thing. Claire will probably end up teaching somewhere. He wasn't wrong that I loved teaching. I'd been tutoring kids in my neighborhood since I was 15, and there was a version of my life where becoming a teacher would have made me deeply happy. But that wasn't the point. The point was that in his mind, my future had already been decided, and it was decided to be smaller than my siblings' futures. Not because of anything I'd done or failed to do, just because, somewhere along the way, he'd already sorted his children into categories, and I'd been placed in the one labeled adequate. I graduated college 2 years later with a degree in business finance, not education, partly, if I'm honest with myself, because some stubborn part of me needed to prove that probably end up teaching somewhere wasn't the ceiling of what I could become. My father came to that graduation. He shook my hand, not hugged me, shook my hand, and said, "Business, huh? Good luck out there. It's a tough world for people without connections." People without connections. As if he hadn't spent my entire childhood making sure I never built any. I smiled, thanked him, and went to find my mother, who was crying happy tears and telling anyone who would listen how proud she was of her daughter. I let her pride fill the space where his should have been. I got good at that, filling gaps with substitutes. It would take me another decade to understand how much that habit was costing me. After college, I moved 4 hours away to take an entry-level position at a regional investment firm. I told everyone it was because of the job opportunity, and that was true. But it was also true that I needed distance. I needed to be somewhere my father's voice wasn't echoing in every room I walked into. The first few years were brutal. I worked 60-hour weeks for a salary that barely covered my studio apartment and student loans. I ate ramen more nights than I'd like to admit. I watched colleagues with wealthier families get promoted faster, not because they were better at the job, but because they had a network, the same kind of connections my father had warned me I didn't have. I called home maybe once a month. My mother always picked up, always asked genuine questions, always remembered small details from our last conversation. My father would occasionally get on the phone for 2, maybe 3 minutes. "Work's busy," he'd say. "Danny's expanding the business. Amanda's engaged, you hear that? Big wedding planned." Then, almost as an afterthought, "You doing okay out there?" I always said yes, even during the year I nearly got evicted because my firm delayed a bonus I was counting on. Even during the 6 months I dealt with crushing anxiety that left me unable to sleep more than 4 hours a night. I said yes, because some part of me still believed that showing weakness would only confirm whatever quiet judgment he'd already made about me. At 26, I met someone. His name was Jason, and for the first time in my adult life, I let myself believe that maybe I'd found the kind of unconditional support I'd been missing at home. We dated for 3 years. I introduced him to my family at Christmas during our second year together, and I remember watching my father shake his hand and say, "So what do you do, Jason?" When Jason mentioned he worked in commercial real estate development, my father's entire posture changed. Suddenly he was interested. Suddenly there were follow-up questions, genuine ones, the kind he'd never asked me about my own career. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being too sensitive. Jason and I got engaged the following spring. I was so happy that for a while I stopped keeping score of the small comments, the constant comparisons, the sighs. I thought maybe this was the beginning of a new chapter where my father's approval simply wouldn't matter anymore, because I'd have my own family, my own home, my own version of the life he never thought I could build. Then, 5 months before the wedding, Jason ended it. Quietly, over dinner, with an explanation about not being ready that I never fully understood, and honestly, still don't. I called my mother first, sobbing so hard I could barely form words. She drove 4 hours that same night just to sit with me on my apartment floor. I didn't call my father. I knew somewhere deep down exactly what his response would be. And a week later, when my mother must have told him what happened, he called me, not to comfort me, but to say, "These things happen for a reason, Claire. Maybe focus on your career for a while instead. Not everyone's cut out for marriage right away." Not everyone's cut out for marriage right away. As if my broken engagement was proof of some deficiency in me, rather than simply something painful that happens to people. I hung up the phone that night and made a decision. I decided I was done waiting for a version of my father who might never exist. I decided that if he wasn't going to see me, I would build a life so large, so undeniable, that eventually, whether he wanted to or not, he would have no choice. That decision, though, didn't come with a roadmap, and the first attempt I made at building something of my own nearly broke me. 6 months after the engagement ended, still raw and looking for something to throw myself into, I quit my stable job at the investment firm and used almost every dollar of my savings to open a small financial consulting practice with a former coworker named Rebecca. We had a good idea, helping small local businesses navigate financing and expansion. And for the first 8 months, it actually seemed to be working. We landed a handful of clients. We rented a tiny two-room office above a dry cleaner. I remember calling my mother, cautiously excited, and telling her about our first big client win. She told my father. I know because 2 weeks later, at a family dinner, he asked, out of nowhere, "How's the little business thing going? Rebecca, is it? You two got a real plan? Or is this one of those things people do for a year and then go back to a real job?" One of those things people do for a year and then go back to a real job. 11 months later, Rebecca and I dissolved the partnership. It wasn't dramatic. We simply hadn't accounted for how slowly small businesses pay their invoices, and a cash flow gap that should have been manageable turned into a hole neither of us could climb out of fast enough. I lost almost $18,000 of my own savings, money I had scraped together over years of careful budgeting. I remember sitting on the floor of that empty little office on our last day, surrounded by boxes, feeling like I had just proven my father right in the most humiliating way possible. I didn't tell him the business had folded. I let him assume, when he eventually asked, that I'd simply moved on to something else. I couldn't bear to hear whatever version of "I told you so" he would have delivered, even gently, even without meaning to be cruel. Some wounds you protect not because you're ashamed of failing, but because you can't survive watching someone you love treat your failure as confirmation of who they always believed you were. I took the failure hard. Harder, honestly, than I took the broken engagement. For a few months, I barely left my apartment outside of work hours. I stopped returning calls from friends. My mother noticed, during one of our phone calls, that something was wrong and drove out to see me unannounced on a Saturday. She found me sitting in the dark in sweatpants I hadn't changed in 2 days, and she didn't ask a single question. She just made tea, sat next to me on the couch, and let me cry until there was nothing left. "You are allowed to fail, Claire," she told me that night. "Failing doesn't tell you who you are. It's what you do after that tells you who you are." I didn't fully believe her at the time, but I held on to that sentence anyway, tucked it away somewhere, because some part of me sensed I would need it again someday. It took almost a year before I felt steady enough to try again. And when I did, I made a decision that would change the entire direction of my life. I would go back to a stable job first, rebuild my savings, and this time, instead of guessing at what kind of business might work, I would spend real time understanding an industry from the inside before ever attempting to build something of my own within it. That decision is what eventually led me to the healthcare finance startup and to the 8 years of quiet, deliberate work that followed. The next 8 years of my life were the hardest and most transformative years I've ever lived, and I lived almost all of them without telling my family the full truth of what I was doing. At 27, I left the investment firm and took a significant pay cut to join a small healthcare finance startup, a company that helped hospitals and clinics restructure debt and secure funding for expansion projects. It felt reckless at the time. My father, when I mentioned it briefly at a family dinner, said, "That sounds like a step backward, financially speaking." I didn't correct him. I just let him believe whatever he wanted to believe. What he didn't know was that I saw something in that small company that most people missed. Healthcare finance was an unglamorous, overlooked corner of the industry, filled with hospitals, especially in smaller and rural communities, desperate for smarter financial structuring to keep their doors open and expand critical services like pediatric care. I worked harder in those years than I ever had in my life. I earned my MBA at night, one class at a time, while working full days. I took on projects nobody else wanted, restructuring deals for hospitals that everyone assumed were doomed to close. Slowly, painstakingly, I built a reputation. Not a flashy one, a quiet one. The kind built on results, not headlines. By the time I was 32, I had helped structure funding for 11 hospital expansion projects across 3 states, including 2 children's health facilities that had been on the verge of shutting their doors permanently. I was promoted to lead a specialized division at the firm. 2 years after that, with the backing of 2 investors who believed in my track record, I left to start my own consulting firm, Whitfield Health Partners, specializing exclusively in funding solutions for pediatric and community health facilities. I told my family almost none of this in real detail. When they asked, I said things like, "Work's going well," or "I started my own small consulting thing." My father's response was always some version of, "Well, that's nice. Just be careful. Most new businesses fail in the first few years." He said this every single year for 4 years, apparently unaware, or unwilling to notice, that Whitfield Health Partners was not only surviving, but growing. I want to pause here and say something important, something I only understood much later in life. I wasn't hiding my success out of humility. I was hiding it because some wounded part of me was still protecting itself. If he didn't know how well I was doing, he couldn't diminish it. He couldn't sigh at it, or compare it to Daniel's construction company, or call it nice, in that flat, dismissive tone he used whenever I shared something that mattered to me. My silence wasn't modesty. It was armor. But armor, I would eventually learn, can only protect you for so long before it starts to feel like a prison of your own making. There's a part of those years I haven't told you yet, and it matters, because it's the part that kept me going when everything felt impossibly heavy. During my second year at the healthcare finance startup, I was assigned to shadow a senior partner named Howard Grant on a restructuring deal for a rural hospital in a farming community 3 hours outside the city. Howard was in his 60s, close to retirement, and had spent his entire career doing exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous work I was just beginning to understand. On our drive back from that first site visit, he asked me why I'd left a stable investment firm job for a startup nobody's heard of. I gave him some polished answer about industry potential and undervalued markets. He just nodded slowly and said, "That's the answer you give in interviews. What's the real answer?" I don't know what made me tell him the truth in that car, but I did. I told him about my father, about probably end up teaching somewhere, about the failed business, the broken engagement, the quiet, aching need to build something so real that it couldn't be dismissed with a sigh. Howard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I've never forgotten. The people who need external proof to believe in themselves usually quit the first time the proof doesn't come fast enough. The ones who make it are the ones who decide to believe in the work itself, long before anyone's clapping for it. You don't need your father to understand healthcare finance to know that what you're building matters. Let the work be the proof. Everything else is just noise. Howard became something I hadn't had before, a mentor who saw potential in me before I'd proven anything spectacular, simply because he paid attention. He pushed me onto harder deals. He vouched for me in rooms I wasn't yet senior enough to be in. When I earned my MBA, sitting in night classes after 12-hour workdays, falling asleep some nights with my laptop still open on my chest, it was Howard who showed up to my small, informal graduation dinner, not my father, who sent a text that read simply, "Congrats, hope it pays off." My mother, too, quietly became my anchor during those years, in ways my father never noticed. She never fully understood the details of hospital debt restructuring or healthcare bond financing, but she asked. Every single phone call, she asked real questions, and she remembered the answers. When I closed my first 7-figure funding deal for a rural clinic network, she was the one who cried on the phone with pride, who asked me to send her a photo of the building so she could see what I helped make happen, a phrase she used instead of "what you did," as if some of the credit belonged to her simply for believing in me when it counted. I started Whitfield Health Partners 3 years later with 2 investors Howard introduced me to personally, men who had watched my work for years and trusted my judgment on projects most firms considered too small or too complicated to bother with. My mother wired me $2,000 the week I signed my first office lease, money I know she'd been quietly saving, without my father's knowledge, specifically in case I ever needed it. I didn't find that out until years later. I cried when she finally told me. By 34, my firm had grown to 22 employees and had structured funding for over 60 healthcare facilities nationwide. I had, by almost any measure, built the undeniable life I promised myself I would build back in that dorm room a decade and a half earlier. And then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Not because of my father, but because of a phone call about a little boy named Tommy Reyes. Tommy Reyes was 7 years old, and he was fighting leukemia at St. Andrew's Children's Hospital, the same hospital, as it happened, in the city where I grew up, less than 20 minutes from my father's house. I learned about Tommy through a colleague who mentioned that St. Andrew's Pediatric Oncology Wing was critically underfunded, running on outdated equipment, with families sometimes forced to travel 2 hours to other cities for specialized treatment that should have been available locally. Families like Tommy's, who didn't have the resources to make that drive every week. Something about it struck me differently than any project before. Maybe it was the fact that it was my hometown. Maybe it was simply time. I flew out, toured the facility, met with hospital administrators, and by the end of that visit, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to personally fund the largest portion of a complete renovation and expansion of St. Andrew's Pediatric Wing, not through my firm's typical consulting arrangement, but through a personal foundation I quietly established, contributing the majority of funds myself, alongside several partner donors I brought on board. I insisted, from the very beginning, that the donation remain anonymous. Not because I didn't want credit, if I'm honest. Some part of me did want credit, wanted it desperately, but because I didn't want the story to become about me. I wanted it to be about the kids, about Tommy, and the dozens of other children who would benefit from updated treatment rooms, a new family support center, and equipment that meant fewer families would have to drive 2 hours away during the hardest moments of their lives. For 14 months, I worked on that project almost entirely behind the scenes. I flew back and forth to my hometown more times than my own family knew, staying in hotels 20 minutes from the house I grew up in, without telling a single member of my family I was even in town. There's a strange kind of loneliness in doing something meaningful in complete secrecy. I remember standing in the half-finished pediatric wing one evening, watching construction crews install a new family lounge, and feeling this overwhelming mixture of pride and grief. Pride, because I was building something real, something that would genuinely change lives. Grief, because the one person whose recognition I'd spent my whole life chasing had no idea any of it existed. I didn't plan at that point for him to ever find out. I told myself the project was for Tommy and for the hundreds of children who would come after him, not for my father. I told myself that so many times that I almost believed it. But the universe, it turns out, has its own sense of timing. 6 weeks before the renovation's completion, the hospital's development board decided to host a gala fundraiser to celebrate the wing's grand opening and to formally recognize its major donors. My foundation's board members, the small handful of people who knew my identity, informed me that the hospital wanted to name the new wing after its lead donor, and that a dedication plaque would be unveiled publicly in front of the city's business and philanthropic community. I could have said no. I could have kept the anonymity intact right through the ribbon cutting. Instead, for reasons I'm still not entirely sure I fully understand even now, I said yes. The gala was scheduled for a Saturday evening in October at the Grand Hallwell Ballroom downtown, a venue known for hosting the city's biggest charity events. As one of the hospital's signature annual fundraisers, the guest list included doctors, city council members, business owners, and, as it turned out, a long list of local contractors and construction companies who had donated services or materials to the renovation project. My brother Daniel's construction company, Whitfield & Sons Builders, a company that, in a strange twist neither of us had planned, shared our family's last name, had been contracted for structural work on the new wing months earlier, long before anyone involved knew the connection between the anonymous donor and the construction company hired for the job. When Daniel found out his company had landed the St. Andrews contract, he was thrilled. It was, by far, the biggest project his business had taken on. My father, who had semi-retired from his own contracting business years earlier, but still liked to be involved in the family trade, as he called it, was invited to the gala as Daniel's guest, representing the family name that had helped build the very walls of that new wing. None of us, not my father, not Daniel, not even my mother, knew that the anonymous lead donor, whose name would be unveiled on that wall that night, was me. I found out, through my foundation's board coordinator, exactly who would be attending 3 days before the event. When she mentioned Whitfield & Sons Builders as one of the recognized contractors, I actually had to sit down. I remember calling my mother that week, dancing carefully around the truth, asking casual questions about whether the family was planning to attend any hospital events lately. She mentioned, without any idea of the significance, that Danny's very excited. They're all going to some fancy dinner for the hospital wing his company helped build. Your father's going too. He's been telling everyone about it. He's been telling everyone about it. I sat with that sentence for a long time. My father, telling everyone about a project I had personally funded, unaware that his own daughter, the one he'd spent 30 years calling adequate at best, was the reason that project existed at all. I had a choice in that moment. I could ask the hospital to postpone the public reveal of my name, protect my anonymity a little longer, avoid whatever complicated confrontation might come from my family, discovering the truth in a room full of 300 strangers. Or I could let it happen exactly as planned, and finally, after everything, let the truth speak in a way that no argument, no conversation, no plea for recognition ever could. I chose to let it happen. I bought a dress. I RSVP'd under my foundation's formal name, Whitfield Family Health Initiative, a name I'd chosen deliberately months before I had any idea my actual family would be sitting in that same ballroom. I told my mother, 2 days before the event, in a phone call I still remember word for word, "Mom, I'm going to be at that gala Saturday. I have some news, but I want you to hear it there, in person." She asked me a dozen questions. I answered none of them. I just said, "Trust me, please, just be there." The ballroom was already half full when I arrived, deliberately 15 minutes after the official start time, wearing a deep emerald dress I'd bought specifically because it was the furthest thing from the muted, unremarkable colors I used to wear at family events, hoping never to draw attention. I spotted my family before they saw me. My mother, elegant in navy, standing near the appetizer table. My brother Daniel, broad-shouldered in an ill-fitting rental tuxedo, laughing loudly with 2 other men I assumed were his business partners. My sister Amanda, 7 months pregnant, glowing, holding her husband's arm. And my father, standing slightly apart from the group, the way he always did at social events, nursing a glass of scotch, scanning the room like he was assessing its value. I stayed near the back for the first 20 minutes, speaking quietly with 2 of my foundation's board members, watching my family from a distance the way you might watch a play you already know the ending to. At one point, I overheard my father talking to a stranger near the bar, a man I didn't recognize, likely another local business owner. "My son's company built this whole wing," my father was saying, gesturing broadly with his Scotch glass. "Whitfield & Sons, good, hard-working company. I raised 3 kids, and let me tell you, only one of them turned out to have any real ambition. Danny here, he's the one who made something of himself. Built a real business from nothing." The stranger asked something I couldn't quite hear, and my father laughed, that same dismissive laugh I'd heard my entire childhood. "The other 2? One's got some office job I don't fully understand, moves around a lot, never really settled into anything solid. The other one's about to have a baby, so we'll see." He took a sip of his scotch. "Danny's really the only one who I can say I actually raised right. Rest of them, I don't know. Sometimes you do everything you can as a parent, and it just doesn't take. Rest of them, I don't know." Sometimes you do everything you can as a parent, and it just doesn't take. 34 years old, standing in a ballroom I had personally helped build, listening to my father tell a stranger that he'd essentially failed to raise me, while completely unaware that I was the reason he was even standing in that room at all. I felt something inside me that I expected to be anger, but it wasn't anger. It was something closer to clarity, a calm, settled certainty that within the next hour, every single word he'd just said would collapse under the weight of the truth. I want to describe that room for a moment, because I remember every detail of it with a clarity that still surprises me, even now. The grand Hallwell ballroom had 12-foot windows along one wall, looking out over the city lights, and the round tables were dressed in white linen with small centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath, meant to echo the hospital's pediatric theme without feeling too clinical. A string quartet played softly near the entrance. Waiters in black vests moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and small appetizers, and the low hum of conversation filled every corner of the room. I remember thinking, standing there in that emerald dress, how strange it was that a room this beautiful, this full of warmth and celebration, was about to become the setting for a truth I had carried in silence for over a year. I remember my hands were slightly cold, despite the warmth of the room, and I kept turning my phone over in my clutch, resisting the urge to check it, even though I knew there was nothing on it that mattered more than what was about to happen in the next 20 minutes. I watched my mother move through the crowd, greeting a few people she recognized from the community, her navy dress catching the light every time she turned. I watched Amanda rest a hand on her pregnant belly while her husband fetched her a sparkling water instead of champagne. I watched Daniel work the room the way he always did at events like this, shaking hands, laughing a little too loudly, clearly enjoying being the center of attention as the contractor whose company had helped build the very walls around us. And I watched my father, standing slightly apart near the bar, the way he always positioned himself at gatherings, close enough to be part of things, far enough to observe and judge from a comfortable distance. A board member from my foundation, a kind older woman named Diane, who was one of only 4 people who knew my full involvement in the project, found me near the back of the room and squeezed my hand. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. "No," I admitted, with a small, nervous laugh. "But I don't think I ever would be. Let's do it anyway." The lights dimmed. The hospital's CEO stepped up to the small stage at the front of the ballroom, tapping the microphone gently. "Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here to celebrate an incredible milestone for St. Andrew's Children's Hospital," she began. "Tonight, we officially open the doors of our newly renovated pediatric care wing, a project that would not have been possible without the extraordinary generosity of our community, our contractors, and one very special donor." I felt my pulse quicken. Across the room, I saw my father lean toward Daniel, whispering something with a proud smile, clearly assuming the recognition about to come was for his son's construction company. "Before we unveil tonight's dedication plaque," the CEO continued, "I want to share a bit about the vision behind this project. 14 months ago, we were approached by a donor who wished to remain anonymous, someone who had a deeply personal commitment to ensuring children in this community never again had to travel hours away for critical pediatric care. This donor didn't just write a check. She personally oversaw every phase of planning, fighting for details most people never would have thought to ask about: family lounges, updated equipment, a healing garden for siblings waiting during long treatments. My mother had gone very still. I saw her head turn slowly, scanning the room, as if some instinct in her had already begun to suspect something the rest of the family hadn't yet considered. Tonight, at her request, we're finally able to share her name publicly, alongside the unveiling of this wing's new dedication. The lights shifted toward the far wall, where a large covered plaque stood mounted beside the entrance to the new pediatric center. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the founder of the Whitfield Family Health Initiative and the lead donor behind the St. Andrew's Pediatric Care Wing, Ms. Claire Whitfield. I want you to imagine, for a moment, 300 faces turning at once, applause rising unevenly, some polite, some enthusiastic, most confused because almost none of them knew who I was. And in the middle of that unfamiliar crowd, four familiar faces frozen in complete, total shock. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel's jaw actually dropped, his champagne glass tilting dangerously in his hand. Amanda grabbed her husband's arm, whispering something urgently, her eyes wide. And my father simply stood there motionless, his scotch glass forgotten halfway to his lips, staring at me across the ballroom like he was seeing a stranger wearing his daughter's face. I walked to the small stage, my heels echoing against the marble floor, in a silence that felt like it stretched for miles, even though it probably lasted only a few seconds. I shook the CEO's hand, thanked her, and turned to face the crowd, and more specifically, to face my family. "Thank you," I began, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I wasn't originally going to speak tonight, but I think, given the circumstances, a few words are needed. I glanced briefly toward the covered plaque beside the entrance. 14 months ago, I decided to fund this project because I believe every child deserves access to excellent care, close to home, close to the people who love them. I chose to remain anonymous because I never wanted this project to be about recognition. I wanted it to be about Tommy Reyes and about every child who will walk through these doors after him. I paused, letting my eyes finally settle on my father, standing frozen near the bar. But I also want to say something else, because I think it matters, and because there are people in this room who need to hear it. For most of my life, I believed that success only counted if it was loud enough, visible enough, impressive enough for the people closest to me to finally notice. I spent years thinking that quiet work, careful work, work that didn't come with trophies or headlines, somehow mattered less. My voice caught slightly, but I kept going. I was wrong. This wing exists because of years of quiet, unglamorous work that nobody was watching. And I've realized, standing here tonight, that the things worth doing in this life rarely come with an audience while you're doing them. Sometimes the people who should be proudest of you are the last ones to know what you've built. Not because you hid it out of shame, but because you stopped needing their permission to be proud of yourself. I looked at the covered plaque one more time. Let's unveil this wing, so these families can finally see what 14 months of work, and honestly, 34 years of learning who I am outside of anyone else's expectations, was really for. The hospital staff pulled the covering away from the plaque. Gold letters, 3 feet tall, caught the ballroom light. The Claire Whitfield Pediatric Care Wing. For every child who deserves care close to home, and every family who deserves hope close to their door. The applause this time was thunderous, genuine, filling the entire ballroom. I saw strangers wiping their eyes. I saw hospital staff hugging each other. I saw Tommy Reyes's mother, standing near the front, crying openly, clutching her son's hand. And I saw my father, standing perfectly still near the bar, staring up at the wall with an expression I had never once seen on his face in 34 years of trying to earn it. He looked, for the very first time in my life, completely and utterly speechless. I found him 20 minutes later, standing alone on the small outdoor terrace attached to the ballroom, away from the noise and the congratulations still pouring in from strangers inside. He didn't hear me approach at first. He was just standing there, hands resting on the stone railing, staring out at nothing in particular. "Dad," I said quietly. He turned, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. I watched something move across his face. Not quite shame, not quite pride. Something more complicated than either. Something I didn't have a name for. 14 months, he finally said. You've been coming back here for 14 months, and none of us knew. I wasn't trying to hide it from you specifically, I said, which was mostly true. I didn't want it to be about recognition. I wanted it to just be about the kids. He was quiet for a long moment. I said some things tonight, before the announcement, at the bar. His jaw tightened. You heard me, didn't you? I didn't answer immediately, but my silence was answer enough. He looked down at his hands, gripping the railing. 30 years, he said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. 30 years I told myself I was being honest with you kids, realistic. I thought if I didn't inflate things, if I didn't make you all think you were more special than you were, you'd work harder, try harder. I thought that's what a good father does. A good father, I said carefully, notices what his children are actually building, instead of deciding in advance what they're capable of. He flinched just slightly, but he didn't argue. I built a company, he continued. Worked with my hands my whole life. I always thought that kind of success, something you could point to, something physical, that was real. Business deals, spreadsheets, whatever it is you do. I never understood it. I never took the time to understand it. It was easier to just assume it wasn't as impressive. It's not about being impressive, Dad, I said, and I felt my voice shake for the first time that night. It's about being seen. That's all I ever wanted. Not applause, not gold letters on a wall, just for you to see me. He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I almost turned to walk away, assuming, as I always had, that this was as far as the conversation would go. Then he said, I saw you tonight. I turned back. Up on that stage, he continued, his voice rough in a way I'd never heard before. I saw exactly who you are, and I'm ashamed, Claire, that it took a plaque on a wall for me to finally look. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo 34 years in a single conversation on a terrace, but it was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me. And in that moment, it was enough to let something in my chest finally loosen. Something that had been tight for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Before I tell you what changed with my father, I want to tell you about 2 conversations I had that same night, because they mattered to me almost as much. I found Daniel near the coat check, still holding a half-empty champagne glass, staring at me with an expression somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like relief. You've been coming back to this city for over a year, he said, and you never once called me. We could have grabbed dinner. I had no idea. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to shut you out specifically. I just needed this to stay quiet until it didn't anymore. He nodded slowly, and then he said something I didn't expect. You know, growing up, I always felt like I had to be the one who made Dad proud. Like it was my job, because I was the oldest, because I was the son. I used to feel bad for you, honestly. I used to think it must be exhausting, constantly being compared to me at everything. He shook his head. I never once thought you were building something like this while I was busy accepting compliments for pouring concrete. Your work matters too, Danny, I said, and I meant it. This wing wouldn't exist without your crew's construction work. We built it together, even if neither of us knew it at the time. He laughed, a real laugh, and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us probably expected. I'm proud of you, he said quietly, into my shoulder. I don't think I've ever actually said that to you before. I'm saying it now. Amanda found me a few minutes later, tears already streaming down her face, one hand resting on her belly. I've been so wrapped up in the wedding and then the pregnancy, and I never asked you real questions about your life, she said. I always just assumed you were fine, because you never seemed to need anything from any of us. I didn't realize that not needing anything and not getting anything might be the same thing sometimes. That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything else said that night. Not needing anything and not getting anything might be the same thing sometimes. I had spent so many years being praised, in a backhanded way, for being low maintenance, for never causing trouble, for always being fine. I hadn't realized until that moment how much that praise had actually been describing my own quiet suffering, dressed up as independence. I'd love for you to be involved in this baby's life, Amanda said, wiping her eyes and laughing at herself. Properly involved, not just the aunt we mention at Christmas. I'd like that too, I told her, and I meant every word. I wish I could tell you that one conversation on a terrace fixed 34 years of quiet wounds overnight. It didn't. Healing, real healing, doesn't work that fast. And I'd be lying to you if I wrapped this up in a bow that neat. But something did shift after that night, slowly, over the following months. My father started asking questions about my work. Real questions, the kind that showed he was actually listening to the answers. He came to visit my office once, about 2 months later, and stood in the small conference room looking at photos from the St. Andrew's renovation, quiet in a way that felt different from his usual dismissiveness. It felt like actual reflection. He never became a different man overnight. There were still moments of old habits creeping back in, an offhand comment here, an instinct to compare me to Daniel or Amanda there. Old patterns don't disappear just because one truth gets revealed under a chandelier. But something had cracked open in him that night, and slowly, carefully, he began doing the work of becoming someone who noticed his children instead of ranking them. At Thanksgiving that year, for the first time in my adult life, he raised his glass during dinner and said, without prompting, without an audience to perform for, "I want to say something about Claire." The table went quiet. I spent a long time not understanding what she was building because I wasn't paying close enough attention to notice. I'm proud of her. I should have said that a long time ago, and I'm sorry it took this long. It wasn't dramatic. There was no applause, no gold plaque, no ballroom full of strangers. Just my family, sitting around an ordinary dinner table, hearing 4 words I had waited 3 decades to hear. I am proud of you. I cried. Not out of hurt this time, but out of something closer to release. There was one particular Sunday, about 4 months after the gala, that I think about often. My father called and asked, almost shyly, if I'd be willing to meet him for lunch. Just the 2 of us, no family event, no occasion to hide behind. We hadn't done that, just the 2 of us, in longer than I could remember. We met at a small diner near his house, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never stopped refilling. He seemed nervous in a way I'd never seen him before, turning his napkin over in his hands before he finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about why I was the way I was with you kids, especially you." He paused. My own father wasn't an easy man either. He didn't believe in praising his children, thought it made you soft, made you stop trying. I swore I'd be different, and somewhere along the way, I became exactly like him without even noticing it happening. I didn't say anything. I just let him keep going. I told myself for years that being hard on you was preparing you for a hard world. But watching you stand on that stage, realizing everything you built without a single word of encouragement from me, I understood something. You didn't need me to be hard on you to succeed. You succeeded in spite of it, not because of it. And I wasted 30 years thinking I was helping, when really, I was just making the road harder than it needed to be. "I don't need you to carry guilt about it forever, Dad," I told him, and I meant it. "I just need you to keep doing what you're doing right now. Keep asking, keep noticing. That's enough." He nodded, and for the rest of that lunch, he asked me questions about my work that showed he'd actually researched some of it beforehand. Basic terms about hospital financing, questions about how foundations like mine typically operate. It wasn't much, on the surface. But for a man who had spent 3 decades barely asking how my day was going, it felt like an entirely different language of love, one he was only just beginning to learn to speak. Tommy Reyes, by the way, finished his treatment successfully 8 months after that gala. His mother sends me a photo every year on the anniversary of his final chemotherapy session. Tommy, a little taller each time, standing in front of the healing garden we built at St. Andrew's. I keep every one of those photos because they remind me why I built that wing in the first place, long before I knew my father would ever stand beneath its name. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, from 34 years of chasing a version of approval that never quite arrived on schedule, it's this. Don't build your worth around the timeline of someone else's recognition. I spent so many years believing that if I just worked a little harder, achieved a little more, made my success a little more undeniable, my father would eventually see me the way I wanted to be seen. And maybe, eventually, He did. But here's the truth. I wish someone had told me back in that dorm room, 17 years old, crying over an empty seat at my graduation. The recognition, when it finally comes, is never actually the point. The real transformation had already happened long before my father looked up at that wall. It happened in every quiet year I spent building something real, without an audience, without applause, simply because it mattered to me and to the people it was meant to help. If you're out there tonight and you've spent your life waiting for someone, a parent, a partner, a boss, anyone, to finally notice what you're building, I want you to hear this clearly. Their timeline is not your deadline. Build the life you're proud of, regardless of who's watching. Let your work speak in rooms you may not even be standing in yet. And if recognition comes, let it be the closing chapter of a story you were already proud of, not the reason you started writing it in the first place. My father finally saw me the night gold letters spelled my name on a hospital wall. But I had already become the woman worth seeing, quietly, patiently, one unglamorous year at a time, long before he ever looked up. That's the part of the story that matters most. Not the plaque, not the gala, not even the apology I waited 3 decades to hear. It's the 14 months, and honestly, the 14 years before that, where I built something real, for its own sake, without waiting for permission to be proud of it. I think about that spelling bee trophy sometimes, still sitting somewhere in a box in my mother's attic, small and plastic and completely unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its history. And I think about the gold letters on that hospital wall, 3 feet tall, catching the light of an entire ballroom. 2 very different symbols, separated by 24 years, but connected by the same quiet lesson. The size of the recognition was never actually the measure of the achievement. A 10-year-old girl who memorized every word on that list deserved to be celebrated exactly as much as the woman who funded a children's hospital wing. The only thing that changed between those 2 moments wasn't my worth. It was simply whether anyone else finally chose to look. That's the part I want you to sit with, whoever you are, listening to this tonight. Maybe you're the overlooked sibling in your own family. Maybe you're the one who's been quietly building something nobody around you has noticed yet. A business, a degree, a recovery, a new version of yourself that took years to construct one unglamorous decision at a time. Maybe, like me, you've spent years mistaking someone else's silence for a verdict on your worth. I want you to hear this clearly. Their silence was never a verdict. It was only ever a limitation of their attention, their fear, their own unresolved history, never a true measurement of what you are actually capable of. My father's inability to see me for 34 years never once changed what I was building. It only changed how long I carried the weight of building it without the comfort of being witnessed. So build anyway. Build in the quiet, if that's what you have available to you right now. Build without applause, without a plaque, without a single person in your life fully understanding what you're doing or why it matters. Let the work itself be the proof, exactly the way Howard once told me it needed to be. And trust that if recognition ever comes, whether it's a hospital wall, a promotion, a reconciliation you never thought possible, or simply the quiet knowledge in your own chest that you did something hard and you did it well, it will only ever be confirming something that was already true long before anyone else caught up to it. My father finally saw me the night gold letters spelled my name on a hospital wall. But I had already become the woman worth seeing, quietly, patiently, one unglamorous year at a time, long before he ever looked up. That's the part of the story that matters most. Not the plaque, not the gala, not even the apology I waited 3 decades to hear. If you take one thing from Claire's story tonight, let it be this. Don't wait for the wall to be built before you decide you're worth being seen. You already are. The world will catch up eventually. It usually does.